March 25th, 1945. A single sheet of paper lands on Dwight Eisenhower's desk at Supreme Headquarters in Rheims, France. The numbers typed on that page are so extraordinary that Eisenhower refuses to believe them until 3 separate intelligence sources independently confirm every single digit. 150,000 German soldiers captured. Not killed, not wounded, captured. Alive, breathing, marching in columns that stretch for miles along the roads of Western Germany. All taken in 14 days by one army under one commander. And here is what makes this story almost impossible to believe. While George Patton was swallowing entire German divisions, whole Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Britain's most celebrated general, was sitting 40 miles north, writing detailed memorandums requesting more ammunition, more fuel, more time. Montgomery needed 3 more weeks to prepare. Patton needed 3 more hours to finish. This is the story of how the fastest general in World War II proved that speed kills more efficiently than bullets. How a man everybody called reckless and dangerous captured more enemy soldiers than some entire Allied nations managed in the whole war. And how one 14-day campaign in a region most people have never heard of changed everything Eisenhower believed about how wars should be won. But to understand how 150,000 Germans ended up marching into American captivity, we need to go back to the situation in early March 1945, because the Allied advance was in serious trouble and almost nobody at Supreme Headquarters wanted to admit it. By the first week of March, the Western Allies had been fighting continuously across France, Belgium, Holland, and into Western Germany for 9 brutal months since D-Day. 9 months of constant combat, 9 months of casualties that never stopped accumulating, 9 months of logistics nightmares stretching supply lines from the Normandy beaches all the way to the German frontier. The Allied armies had reached the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland, and they had stopped. Not because the Germans had suddenly become stronger. German forces were bleeding men and equipment at catastrophic rates they could never replace. Not because Allied soldiers were unwilling to fight. American, British, Canadian, and French troops had demonstrated extraordinary courage and endurance across every battlefield in Western Europe. They stopped because the Allied command structure was paralyzed by a fundamental disagreement about what to do next. The Rhine River is not an ordinary river. It is one of the widest, deepest, fastest-flowing rivers in all of Europe. Crossing it under enemy fire is one of the most dangerous military operations imaginable. Every general in the Allied command knew that the Rhine crossing would be costly in blood. The question that divided them was simple but had no easy answer. How do you cross it? Montgomery's answer was elaborate, massive, and characteristically methodical. He proposed Operation Plunder, an enormous set-piece river crossing that would rival D-Day itself in scale and complexity. Tens of thousands of troops, thousands of boats and amphibious vehicles, massive airborne drops behind German lines, artillery bombardments that would consume ammunition stocks measured in thousands of tons. The preparation alone would require weeks. Montgomery submitted supply requisitions that staggered even the experienced logistics officers at Supreme Headquarters. He wanted 118,000 tons of supplies pre-positioned before the first soldier touched water. He wanted 5,500 artillery pieces registered on targets across the river. He wanted complete air supremacy guaranteed over the crossing sector for the entire duration of the operation. His planning documents ran to over 700 pages of detailed instructions specifying which unit would cross where, at what time, in what order, carrying what equipment. Every single detail was calculated, documented, and scheduled. It was a masterpiece of military planning. And Eisenhower was quietly losing his mind watching the calendar while Montgomery perfected his masterpiece. Because every day Montgomery spent preparing was another day German commanders spent doing exactly the same thing. reinforcing positions, laying mines, digging trenches, moving reserve divisions into blocking positions along the Rhine. The paradox was almost painful to contemplate. Montgomery's massive preparation was designed to overcome German resistance, but the longer he prepared, the stronger that resistance became. He was running on a treadmill, and he did not seem to realize it. But everything was about to change because of a man whose entire philosophy of war could be summarized in 11 words. He once barked at a subordinate who asked for more time to prepare. George Smith Patton Jr. was not what anyone would call a subtle commander. Born to wealth and privilege in California, educated at West Point, obsessed with military history. Since childhood, Patton had spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this kind of moment. He was 60 years old in March 1945. He had already been nearly fired twice during the war for slapping hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice. He had been publicly humiliated, stripped of command, used as a decoy during D-Day while other generals led the real invasion. Lesser men would have been destroyed by such treatment. Patton simply got angrier and more determined. What made Patton fundamentally different from every other Allied commander was not his courage, though he had plenty. It was not his tactical knowledge, though he was brilliantly well-read in military history. What made Patton unique was his absolute conviction that speed was the deadliest weapon in modern warfare. More deadly than artillery, more deadly than air power, more deadly than the atomic bomb that was being secretly assembled in New Mexico at that very moment. Patton believed with religious intensity that an army moving at maximum speed creates chaos in the enemy's mind that no amount of firepower can achieve. A general who waits for perfect conditions will wait forever. A general who moves fast enough makes perfect conditions irrelevant. And in early March 1945, staring at maps showing Montgomery's glacial preparations in the north, Patton saw something that made his blood run hot. The German defenders defending the Palatinate region south of Montgomery's sector were strong on paper but brittle in reality. They had men and guns, but they were desperately short of fuel, ammunition, and above all, morality. These were soldiers who knew the war was lost. They were going through the motions of defense because their officers told them to, not because they believed it would change anything. Patton looked at those Germans and saw not a defensive line to be carefully breached through weeks of preparation. He saw 150,000 prisoners waiting to be collected. All he needed was permission to move. The request Patton sent to Eisenhower's headquarters on March 11th was characteristically blunt and almost insultingly brief compared to Montgomery's 700-page opus. Patton wanted authorization to attack through the Palatinate with Third Army at full speed. He did not request additional supplies, he did not ask for more divisions, he did not submit a detailed operational plan with timetables and phase lines. He simply asked to be unleashed. Eisenhower's staff officers were deeply skeptical. The Palatinate terrain was terrible for armored operations. Broken hills, dense forests, narrow roads, multiple river crossings. Traditional military doctrine said you needed overwhelming superiority to attack through such terrain. Patton did not have overwhelming superiority. He had determination, speed, and a complete willingness to ignore any rule that slowed him down. Eisenhower, caught between Montgomery's agonizing deliberation and Patton's aggressive impatience, made a decision that would shape the final weeks of the European war. He gave Patton authorization to attack on March 13th. No additional resources, no reinforcements, no special supply priority, just permission. That was all Patton had ever wanted. March 13th, 1945, 5 in the morning. The Palatinate Offensive begins not with the thunderous artillery barrage that traditionally announces a major attack. There is no warning at all. Armored columns from Third Army simply start moving forward on multiple routes, simultaneously pushing into German-held territory at speeds that would have seemed reckless even for peacetime maneuvers. The German defenders, expecting the Americans to follow standard doctrine with preliminary bombardments and carefully phased advances, are caught completely off balance.
reports start flooding into German headquarters of American tanks appearing in locations considered impossible to reach. One German division commander receives word that American tanks have been spotted 20 miles behind his front line. He dismisses the report as fantasy. 3 hours later, those same American tanks overrun his headquarters. Within 72 hours, Patton's forces have penetrated over 30 miles into German territory on a front 60 miles wide. German defensive plans, carefully constructed over weeks, are rendered worthless in less than 3 days. Communication lines are cut, supply routes are blocked. Entire German regiments wake up on the morning of March 16th to discover that American forces have passed completely around them during the night, and they are now surrounded, with no way out. By March 20th, 1 week into the offensive, the German First Army and Seventh Army are fragmenting into dozens of isolated pockets.
He expected a routine coordination meeting. He expected to present his updated timeline for Operation Plunder, his massive Rhine crossing, which was now scheduled for March 31st. After weeks of elaborate preparation, he expected Eisenhower to approve additional resource allocations. What he got instead was a quiet, controlled confrontation that stripped away every comfortable assumption he had been operating under. Eisenhower began by congratulating Montgomery on his preparations for the Rhine crossing. Then he placed Patton's after-action report on the table between them. 150,000 prisoners, 14 days, no additional supplies requested, no reinforcements required. 2 German armies eliminated as fighting forces. And then Eisenhower added one detail that hit Montgomery like a physical blow. Patton's forces had already crossed the Rhine, not through a massive planned operation with 700 pages of instructions and 118,000 tons of prepositioned supplies. Patton's troops had seized a bridge at Oppenheim on the night of March 22nd, 3 days before Montgomery learned the final prisoner count. Elements of the 5th Infantry Division had paddled across the Rhine in small assault boats with minimal artillery support, established a bridgehead, and engineers had a pontoon bridge operational within hours. Patton had called Bradley that night with a message that became legendary. Quote, "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty." Montgomery's face, according to Dunnigan's private diary, went completely still. The implications were unmistakable. Montgomery had spent weeks preparing the largest river crossing operation since D-Day. He had requested astronomical quantities of supplies. He had demanded complete air supremacy. He had planned airborne drops involving tens of thousands of paratroopers. And while he was still perfecting his preparations, Patton had simply crossed the Rhine with a handful of infantry and rowboats. The meeting that followed lasted 2 hours. Eisenhower never raised his voice. He never directly criticized Montgomery's methods. He did not need to. The numbers spoke with a volume that no words could match. 150,000 prisoners versus Montgomery's 23,000 in the same time period. A Rhine crossing accomplished with assault boats versus an operation requiring weeks of additional preparation. Third Army advancing 40 miles per day versus Montgomery's forces advancing methodically at 8 to 12 miles per day when they moved at all. Eisenhower presented his new strategic directive. Third Army would receive supply priority for continued offensive operations east of the Rhine. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would continue its planned crossing, but would advance as rapidly as possible once across, abandoning the methodical phase line approach in favor of aggressive exploitation. The boundary between American and British sectors would be adjusted to give Patton's forces more operational room. Every single element of the directive was designed to maximize the operational tempo that Patton had proven so devastatingly effective. Montgomery protested. He argued that his methods were proven and sound. He argued that Patton's Rhine crossing was reckless and could have been repulsed by a determined counterattack. He argued that speed without security was a gamble, not a strategy. Eisenhower listened patiently to every argument. Then he pointed to the prisoner count one more time. 150,000 soldiers who would never fire another shot at Allied troops. That number was not a gamble, it was a result. When Montgomery left Reims that evening, Dunnigan confided to a colleague that it was the first time he had seen Montgomery genuinely shaken by a meeting with Eisenhower. Not angry, not defiant, shaken. The ground had shifted beneath him, and he knew it. But Eisenhower's confrontation with Montgomery was only the political battle. The operational battle was still unfolding across Germany at breathtaking speed, and the numbers that had already stunned Supreme Headquarters were about to grow even more staggering, because Patton was not finished. He was not even close to finished. The Palatinate campaign had eliminated German resistance west of the Rhine. Now, with his forces across the river and Eisenhower's authorization to continue attacking, Patton unleashed Third Army into the German heartland with a fury that defied comprehension. Between March 26th and April 10th, Third Army advanced over 150 miles into central Germany. The speed of advance was so extreme that Patton's headquarters frequently lost track of exactly where his leading elements were. Division commanders reported capturing towns that were not yet marked as objectives on the operational maps. Armored spearheads drove through German rear areas so fast that they passed supply depots, ammunition dumps, and military installations before their garrisons even knew Americans were in the area. German soldiers woke up in the morning to discover that American tanks had driven past their positions during the night without stopping. The prisoner count, already extraordinary, became almost incomprehensible. The 150,000 from the Palatinate was just the beginning. In the first 2 weeks of April, Third Army captured an additional 200,000 German soldiers. Some days, individual divisions reported capturing more prisoners than they had soldiers in their own formation. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's favorite and most aggressive unit, captured 30,000 prisoners in a single week while suffering fewer than 200 casualties of its own. The ratio was almost surreal. For every American soldier wounded, 150 German soldiers surrendered. The logistics of processing this human flood became Third Army's greatest operational challenge. Military police companies designed to handle hundreds of prisoners were dealing with tens of thousands. Prisoner processing centers that could document 500 men per day were receiving 5,000. German prisoners were organized into massive temporary camps in open fields, supervised by their own officers, fed from captured German supply depots because American rations could not stretch far enough. And the psychological impact on remaining German forces was catastrophic. Word spread through the German military with terrifying speed. The Americans are not fighting, they are collecting. Entire units that might have resisted for days or weeks against a methodical advance simply dissolved when they learned that Patton's forces were approaching. Company commanders conducted quiet polls among their men. Do we fight or surrender? The answer increasingly was unanimous. We surrender. German generals captured during this period provided intelligence officers with assessments that confirmed everything Patton had always believed about the power of speed. General Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran of the Africa Corps who had fought against both Montgomery and Patton, told his interrogators something remarkable. Against Montgomery, we always knew what was coming. We could prepare, we could plan our withdrawals, we could save our men. Against Patton, we knew nothing. His forces appeared from directions we considered impossible. They moved at speeds we could not match. By the time we understood what was happening, it was already too late. Montgomery was an opponent we could fight. Patton was a catastrophe we could only survive. By mid-April 1945, the combined prisoner total attributed to Third Army operations since March 13th had passed 350,000. Patton had captured more enemy soldiers in 30 days than the entire British Army had captured in the 11 months since D-Day. The comparison was politically explosive and strategically undeniable. Speed had won. Preparation had been left behind. But as Patton's forces drove deeper into Germany, they were about to encounter something that no amount of speed or tactical brilliance could prepare them for, something that would transform this war from a military campaign into a moral reckoning. On April 4th, advance elements of the 4th Armored Division approached a small town in central Germany called Ohrdruf. The soldiers expected to find another German garrison waiting to surrender. What they found instead would transform this war from a campaign of territory into a campaign of conscience, and it would answer a question that nobody at Supreme Headquarters had thought to ask. What had Montgomery's delays actually cost in human lives that were not soldiers? The German High Command's reaction to Patton's Palatinate breakthrough was not panic, it was something worse. It was paralysis. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had replaced the aging Garrett von Rundstedt on March 10th, arrived at his new headquarters to discover that the situation was deteriorating faster than his staff could track it. Intelligence reports from the Palatinate sector were arriving hours late because the communication networks they traveled through kept getting overrun by American forces. By the time Kesselring read a report about American positions, those positions had already advanced 20 miles beyond what the report described. Kesselring was not an incompetent commander. He had conducted a masterful defensive campaign in Italy that held Allied forces at bay for nearly 2 years. He understood defensive warfare better than almost any German general alive. But everything he knew about defense assumed a certain operational tempo. Defenders need time to identify threats, shift reserves, prepare fallback positions, coordinate withdrawals. Patton's advance eliminated time from the equation entirely. Kesselring ordered counterattacks. The units designated to counterattack had already been bypassed and surrounded before they received their orders. He ordered defensive lines established along rivers and ridge lines. Patton's forces crossed those rivers and ridge lines before German engineers could lay a single mine.
He ordered reserves moved from quiet sectors to threatened sectors. The reserves arrived to discover that the threatened sector had moved 50 miles east since the order was issued. German staff officers at OKW, the Supreme Military Headquarters, compiled statistics that painted a picture of accelerating collapse. In the first week of March, German forces on the Western Front had lost approximately 30,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. In the second week, during Patton's Palatinate Offensive, losses jumped to 90,000. In the third week, with Patton across the Rhine and other armies following his example of aggressive advance, losses exceeded 150,000. The graph was not declining gradually, it was falling off a cliff. German commanders attempted to adapt. Orders went out prohibiting surrender under penalty of death. Military police units were positioned behind front lines with authority to shoot soldiers attempting to desert. Improvised courts-martial were established to try officers who abandoned positions without authorization. These desperate measures had some temporary effect. Some units that might have surrendered chose to fight instead, knowing that SS enforcement squads were watching. But the measures could not change the fundamental reality that Patton had created. German forces were being encircled and destroyed faster than any enforcement mechanism could prevent. And then the adaptation attempts turned darker. As Third Army drove deeper into Germany, advancing units began encountering evidence that German authorities were attempting to destroy something far more damaging than military equipment. They were trying to destroy evidence. But that was not the only crisis unfolding. Inside the Allied command structure itself, Patton's success was creating problems that threatened to undermine everything his speed had accomplished. The internal crisis hit Third Army on April 2nd in the form of a logistics report that Patton's chief of staff called the most dangerous document of the entire campaign. Third Army's supply lines now stretched over 400 miles from forward depots to the leading armored spearheads. Fuel consumption was running at 350,000 gallons per day, nearly double the allocated amount. Ammunition stocks for certain critical calibers were down to 2 days of supply. Replacement parts for tanks and vehicles were virtually non-existent. Maintenance crews were cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep operational ones running. The report recommended that Third Army halt its advance for a minimum of 5 days to allow supply lines to consolidate. 5 days. In 5 days, German forces could establish new defensive lines. Demoralized units could receive reinforcements. The momentum that had captured 150,000 prisoners could evaporate. Patton's reaction to the logistics report was characteristic. He called his supply officers into his headquarters and told them something that perfectly captured his philosophy.
"I don't care where you get it. Steal it from the British if you have to. But my tanks do not stop." And his supply officers, through a combination of creative requisitioning, captured German fuel stocks, and what can only be described as authorized theft from other American Army supply depots, managed to keep Third Army moving. Barely. The tanks did not stop, but Patton knew he was operating on borrowed time. If his advance stalled now, every critic who had called him reckless would be proven right. Speed was not just his strategy, it was his only option. Slowing down meant failure, and failure meant Montgomery's cautious approach would become the accepted doctrine for the rest of the war. But then on April 4th, a single discovery changed the entire moral calculus of the debate between speed and caution in ways that nobody could have predicted. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command B reaches Ohrdruf at approximately 1400 hours on April 4th. Resistance is light, a few scattered shots from disorganized German defenders who flee almost immediately. The town itself is unremarkable, small, provincial, the kind of place that appears on military maps as a minor waypoint between larger objectives. But scouts report a fenced compound on the outskirts of town, a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp system. The gates are open, the guards have fled. What the soldiers find inside stops the entire advance cold. Bodies, dozens of bodies lying in the open, emaciated beyond recognition as human beings. Some have been shot, others appear to have simply starved to death. The living are barely distinguishable from the dead. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms stare at American soldiers with eyes that seem unable to process what they are seeing. The smell is overwhelming. Hardened combat veterans who have fought across France and into Germany without flinching begin vomiting. Some weep openly. The camp is small by the standards of what will later be discovered at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. Approximately 11,000 prisoners had been held here. Thousands were force-marched away in the days before the American arrival, death marches intended to prevent liberation. Those left behind were the ones too weak to walk. They were left to die. Patton arrives at Ohrdruf on April 12th with Eisenhower and Bradley. What follows is one of the most documented and emotionally devastating moments of the entire war. Eisenhower, the supreme diplomatic commander who has maintained composure through every crisis of the war, orders every American unit in the area that is not actively engaged in combat to visit the camp. He wants witnesses. He wants documentation. He wants the world to see what was hidden behind German lines. Patton, the toughest general in the American Army, the man who slaps soldiers for showing weakness, walks behind a building and vomits. He later writes to his wife that it was the most horrible sight he has ever witnessed in a lifetime spent on battlefields. But Patton processes the horror differently than the other commanders. Where Eisenhower sees a moral atrocity requiring documentation and justice, Patton sees a tactical argument more powerful than any he has ever made. Every day the war continues, camps like this continue operating. Every week Montgomery spends preparing, people in these camps die. Speed is no longer just a military advantage. Speed is a moral imperative. Patton returns to his headquarters and issues orders that Third Army will advance at maximum possible speed, regardless of supply constraints. He tells his corps commanders that every hour of delay is measured not just in military opportunity lost, but in civilian lives lost. The advance accelerates in the week following Ohrdruf. Army covers an average of 35 miles per day across a front 100 miles wide. The prisoner count climbs past 200,000, then 250,000, then 300,000. On April 11th, Third Army elements participate in the liberation of Buchenwald itself. Over 21,000 survivors are found in conditions that make Ohrdruf seem almost bearable by comparison. The documentation teams Eisenhower has ordered to accompany advancing units photograph everything, film everything, record the testimony of survivors who can still speak. The news reaches the Allied home front like a shockwave. Newspapers publish photographs that editors debate whether to print because they are so disturbing. Radio broadcasts describe conditions that listeners struggle to believe. And in every story, one question repeats with increasing urgency. How long had this been happening, and could it have been stopped sooner? The implications for the speed versus caution debate are devastating and impossible to ignore. Eisenhower's post-war staff calculations estimated that every week the war was shortened saved approximately 15,000 lives in the concentration camp system alone. Not soldiers, civilians, prisoners, human beings whose survival depended entirely on how fast Allied armies could reach them. If Patton's aggressive approach shortened the war by even 3 weeks compared to what Montgomery's methodical pace would have achieved, the mathematics of speed becomes the mathematics of 45,000 human lives. Montgomery never publicly acknowledged this dimension of the debate. His memoirs discuss the final campaign in terms of military operations, supply logistics, and strategic objectives. The camps are mentioned briefly. The connection between operational tempo and civilian survival is never drawn explicitly, but others drew it for him. American newspapers ran editorials with headlines that asked pointed questions. British journalists who had previously supported Montgomery's cautious approach fell conspicuously silent on the topic. The combined impact of Patton's military success and the moral revelation of the camps created a strategic consensus at Supreme Headquarters that had not existed before April 1945. Speed was no longer just one valid approach among several. It was the only morally acceptable approach. Every commander on the Western Front received directives to advance at maximum speed. Even Montgomery's 21st Army Group, still methodical by temperament and training, accelerated significantly in the final weeks. By April 15th, Third Army had captured over 350,000 prisoners and liberated multiple concentration camps and forced labor facilities across central Germany. Patton's forces had advanced further and faster than any army in the history of mechanized warfare. The comparison with Montgomery was no longer a matter of professional debate. It was settled history, written in numbers that could not be argued with. Patton received no medal for the Palatinate campaign, no special commendation for the Rhine crossing, no formal recognition from Supreme Headquarters for the prisoner count that had reshaped the final month of the war. Eisenhower praised Third Army in official communications, but was careful to maintain the diplomatic balance between American and British contributions. The recognition that mattered came from the soldiers themselves, from the prisoners who were captured quickly enough to survive the war, from the camp survivors who owed their lives to the speed of an army that refused to stop moving. But what happened to the man behind that army after the guns fell silent? What became of the general who proved that speed saves lives and caution costs them? The answer to that question is the final chapter of this story, and it is perhaps the most unexpected chapter of all, because the same qualities that made Patton the most effective combat commander of the war would destroy him within months of the war's end. The war was ending, but Patton's war was about to begin its strangest and most tragic chapter. From a dismissed idea to a doctrine that reshaped modern warfare. In Part 1, we watched Patton ignore every rule Montgomery considered sacred and unleash Third Army into the Palatinate with nothing but speed and fury. In Part 2, we sat in the room at Rheims when Eisenhower confronted Montgomery with the mathematics of 150,000 prisoners and a Rhine crossing accomplished with rowboats. In Part 3, we walked through the gates of Ohrdruf and Buchenwald with soldiers who discovered that speed was not just a military advantage, but a moral imperative. That every week the war continued meant 15,000 more civilian deaths in the camp system alone. We left off with a question. What happens when the fastest general in World War II is told to stop moving? The answer contains a twist that nobody who followed Patton's triumphant spring campaign could have predicted, because the same qualities that made George Patton the most effective combat commander of the war would destroy him within months of the war's end. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The guns fall silent across the continent. Soldiers who have fought for years allow themselves to believe they might actually survive.
In cities and villages across the Allied nations, celebrations erupt. Churchill addresses Parliament. Truman addresses the nation. Eisenhower issues a characteristically diplomatic statement praising the combined Allied effort. And George Patton, the general whose spring campaign captured more prisoners than any single commander in American military history, stands in his headquarters in Bavaria, staring at a map of a country that no longer needs conquering. He has absolutely no idea what to do with himself. The transition from war to peace should have been Patton's moment of greatest triumph. Third Army's final statistics were staggering by any measure. From March 13th to the German surrender, Patton's forces captured over 350,000 enemy soldiers. They liberated tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. They advanced further and faster than any army in the history of mechanized warfare, covering over 600 miles in less than 2 months. The cost was remarkably low for operations of such scale. Third Army suffered approximately 21,000 casualties during the final campaign, a ratio of roughly 1 American casualty for every 17 German soldiers removed from the battlefield. No other army on any front in any theater achieved anything remotely comparable. Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria, the largest and most important occupation zone in the American sector. It was a position that demanded exactly the qualities Patton did not possess: diplomacy, patience, political sensitivity, administrative competence in civilian affairs. Within weeks, Patton was making public statements that horrified Washington. He compared the Nazi Party to American political parties, suggesting that denazification was excessive and unnecessary. He openly advocated for rearming German forces to fight the Soviet Union, a position that was strategically prescient but politically catastrophic. In 1945, he referred to displaced persons, many of them Holocaust survivors, in language that generated furious newspaper headlines. Eisenhower, who had protected Patton through the slapping incidents, through the security breach before D-Day, through every political controversy of the war, finally reached his limit. On October 2, 1945, Patton was relieved of command of Third Army and reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper organization with no troops whose sole purpose was writing the official history of the war. It was the military equivalent of exile. The fastest general in World War II was given a desk and told to write reports. Patton understood what the assignment meant. In his diary, he wrote words that revealed a man who could not exist outside the context of war. A soldier's place is on the battlefield. Take that away, and you take away everything that makes him alive. On December 9, 1945, 7 months after the German surrender, Patton's staff car was struck by a military truck near Mannheim, Germany. He suffered a broken neck that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21st, at the age of 60. The general who survived every battlefield of the war was killed by a traffic accident on a peacetime road. But Patton's legacy did not die on that road outside Mannheim. It did not even slow down. The doctrine of operational tempo that Patton proved in the Palatinate became the foundation of American military thinking for the next 8 decades. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. Speed paralyzes, momentum destroys. An enemy who cannot react cannot defend. Every major American military operation since 1945 has been designed around this core concept that Patton demonstrated with such devastating effectiveness in March and April of 1945. In Korea, General Matthew Ridgway studied Patton's Palatinate campaign before launching the counteroffensive that drove Chinese forces back across the 38th parallel in 1951. Ridgway specifically cited Patton's principle that aggressive forward movement solves more problems than defensive preparation creates. In Vietnam, the failure to apply Patton's tempo-based approach in a war that devolved into static attrition was one of the central critiques of American strategy. Military reformers argued that the methodical, firepower-heavy approach that characterized operations in Southeast Asia was precisely the kind of warfare Patton had proven inferior in 1945. But it was the Gulf War of 1991 that provided the most dramatic validation of everything Patton believed. General Norman Schwarzkopf's famous left hook through the Iraqi desert was a direct descendant of Patton's Palatinate envelopment. American armored forces advanced over 150 miles in 100 hours, encircling and destroying Iraqi forces through speed and maneuver rather than prolonged attrition.
The parallels were so obvious that military historians called it Patton's ghost riding with the 7th Corps across the desert. The result was strikingly similar. Over 80,000 Iraqi soldiers captured in 4 days. An enemy army that was the 4th largest in the world rendered combat ineffective not through superior firepower, but through operational tempo it could not match. The doctrine continued evolving. In 2003, the advance on Baghdad covered 350 miles in 21 days, a pace that would have impressed even Patton. Modern American military planning documents explicitly reference the concept of decision superiority through tempo, language that translates Patton's battlefield instincts into 21st century terminology. NATO adopted similar doctrines. Over 40 nations now train their armored forces using principles that trace directly back to what Third Army demonstrated in the spring of 1945. The total number of military operations influenced by Patton's tempo doctrine is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest that his principles have shaped conflicts on every continent except Antarctica. Montgomery's legacy followed a different trajectory. He remained a respected figure in British military history, was elevated to Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, and published memoirs that carefully positioned his methodical approach as the responsible counterpart to American recklessness. His defenders argued, not without some justification, that Montgomery's careful planning reduced British casualties during the war, and that his set-piece victories demonstrated professional competence of the highest order. But the strategic verdict of history has been less kind than Montgomery's memoirs suggest. But the deepest lesson of this story is not about tanks or tempo or even about the rivalry between two extraordinary commanders. It is about a truth that extends far beyond the battlefield into every domain where human beings face urgent problems and must choose between the comfort of preparation and the risk of action. Every institution in every era faces the same fundamental choice that Eisenhower faced in March 1945. Do we prepare more or do we act now? Do we wait for perfect conditions or do we move with what we have? Do we follow the proven methodology or do we trust the unconventional instinct? Montgomery's approach is always safer. It is always more defensible. It always looks more professional on paper. When careful preparation produces mediocre results, nobody gets fired because the process was sound. When aggressive action fails, the person who championed it takes all the blame. This asymmetry in consequences is why institutions everywhere, military, corporate, governmental, academic, consistently favor caution over speed. The incentive structure rewards preparation and punishes risk. Montgomery is promoted because his methods are safe. Patton is nearly fired because his methods are dangerous. The fact that Patton's dangerous methods produce dramatically superior results does not change the institutional calculus because institutions measure process, not outcomes. This pattern has repeated across centuries of military history. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed in 1925 for aggressively advocating air power that would prove decisive in the very war Mitchell predicted. Heinz Guderian was repeatedly overruled by superiors who considered his armored warfare theories reckless until those theories conquered France in 6 weeks. John Boyd, the fighter pilot who revolutionized American military strategy with his OODA loop concept, was systematically marginalized by a Pentagon bureaucracy that found his aggressive ideas threatening. The Montgomerys of every generation hold positions of authority. The Pattons of every generation fight to be heard. And there is one final detail about Patton's Palatinate campaign that most historians overlook.
a detail that emerged from classified after-action reports that remained restricted until the 1990s. When Third Army's intelligence officers compiled their final assessment of the campaign, they discovered something remarkable in the interrogation records of captured German generals. 17 senior German commanders were asked the same question independently. At what point did you realize the campaign was lost? Their answers were virtually identical, and the answer was not what anyone expected. They did not cite a specific battle. They did not cite the loss of a particular town or river crossing. They did not cite the moment their forces were surrounded. 16 of the 17 commanders gave answers that pointed to the same phenomenon. They knew the campaign was lost when they realized they could no longer think fast enough to respond to what was happening. Not fight fast enough, think fast enough. Patton had not just outmaneuvered their forces, he had outrun their minds. The speed of his advance exceeded the speed at which German commanders could process information, evaluate options, and make decisions. By the time a German general understood the situation at 0800, Patton's forces had already created a completely different situation by 10 o'clock. Decision-making itself became impossible. Every order was obsolete before it could be executed. Every plan was irrelevant before it could be implemented. Patton had discovered through pure combat instinct rather than theoretical analysis the principle that John Boyd would later formalize as the OODA loop. Get inside your enemy's decision cycle, and you do not just defeat him, you make him defeat himself. The German armies in the Palatinate were not destroyed by American tanks, they were destroyed by their own inability to think at the speed Patton demanded. From a cavalryman who believed speed was everything to 350,000 German soldiers proved he was right. From an idea that every cautious commander called reckless to a doctrine that 40 nations now consider fundamental, George Patton proved in 14 days what institutions spend decades refusing to accept, that action at 80% readiness almost always beats preparation for 100% readiness that never arrives. 350,000 German soldiers captured, multiple concentration camps liberated weeks earlier than any methodical approach could have achieved, an estimated 45,000 civilian lives saved by the acceleration of the war's end, and a doctrine of speed and decisive action that has shaped every major military operation for 80 years. The next time someone tells you your idea is too aggressive, too risky, too fast, remember the general who captured entire armies while his rival was still counting bullets. Remember that the greatest danger in any crisis is not moving too fast, it is moving too slow. Patton once said that a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. 150,000 Germans in the Palatinate learned exactly what he meant. And Montgomery, with his 700 pages of perfect planning, never captured that many soldiers in the entire war. If this story of how speed defeated preparation and momentum defeated caution fascinated you, this is only one of hundreds of untold stories from the war that changed everything. Share in the comments which military rivalry you want us to explore next. Subscribe so you never miss a video. And remember what 16 German generals admitted when the classified files were finally opened. They were not beaten by firepower. They were beaten by a man who moved faster than they could think. That is the power of speed. And that is the legacy of George S. Patton.